At 9:47 a.m., February 14th, 1945, Bataan Peninsula, Philippines. Private First Class Domingo. Mingo Reyes, Philippine Commonwealth Army, 2nd Infantry Regiment, crouched in a flooded rice paddy 240 meters from Japanese fortifications, watching 11 enemy machine gun nests suppress his entire company, while the nearest American air support was 17 kilometers away and wouldn't arrive for another 43 minutes. Strapped across his back was a weapon no Philippine officer had authorized for combat, a modified bamboo tube launcher he'd assembled from irrigation pipe, bicycle inner tubes, and captured Japanese grenades, capable of lobbing explosives in a high arc that conventional doctrine said would never achieve battlefield accuracy. On the forward Japanese position sat 180 meters ahead, just beyond effective rifle range, but well within the theoretical trajectory of his contraption. In approximately 6 minutes, when the enemy's next ammunition resupply team crossed the open ground between their bunkers, Reyes would either validate months of secret testing or confirm every superior officer's assessment that improvised weapons were suicide tools wielded by desperate amateurs. But wars aren't won by credentials. They're won by men who see solutions where doctrine sees only problems. The thing about being underestimated is that it gives you room to work. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now. And let's see which corner of the world has the most War Legend fans. Don't just scroll. I'll type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. Reyes had learned this truth over 4 months of watching American and Filipino officers dismiss his proposals, his observations, his carefully documented firing tables. Now, lying in terror that stank of mud and blood, feeling the bamboo launcher press against his spine, he understood that the next 6 minutes would either prove him right or make him a corpse with a reputation for creative stupidity. The morning sun burned through the dissipating fog, illuminating the killing field that had become Bataan's agricultural heartland. Behind him, scattered across 300 meters of devastated farmland, lay the remnants of Charlie Company, 68 men reduced to 41 effectives after 3 days of static warfare against an enemy that had turned every barn, every dike, every farmhouse into a fortress. Captain Thomas Hendrickson, the American advisor coordinating the Philippine units, had been explicit in his morning briefing. We hold until air support arrives. No heroics, no individual initiatives. We've lost too many men to improvisation already. Reyes had nodded with the others, said nothing, and made his decision. The bamboo launcher stayed strapped to his back, because 43 minutes was an eternity in combat, and the Japanese resupply pattern he'd been tracking for 2 days wouldn't wait for American doctrine to catch up with battlefield reality. Domingo Reyes was 23 years old, a farmer's son from Pampanga province, who'd joined the Commonwealth Army in 1943 with a high school education, working knowledge of agricultural mechanics, and absolutely no family military tradition to recommend him. Before the war, he'd repaired irrigation pumps, maintained rice threshers, and occasionally helped his uncle adapt fishing equipment for the Candaba Swamp's unique ecosystem. The military assigned him to supply logistics, hauling ammunition, managing inventory, essentially functioning as a mobile warehouse clerk with a rifle. Nobody expected tactical innovations from a supply private. Certainly not Lieutenant Alfonso Cruz, the Philippine officer who'd supervised Reyes through basic training and consistently rated him adequate but unexceptional in every evaluation. Cruz represented the old guard, Manila-educated, descended from a family of Spanish-era ilustrados, and is thoroughly convinced that modern warfare required modern education, and that improvisation was the domain of guerrillas, not professional soldiers. Armies win through discipline and doctrine, Cruz had lectured, during a supply depot inspection in December 1944, not through farm boy tinkering. Reyes had absorbed the criticism in silence, the way he'd learned to absorb everything by watching, listening, cataloging useful information while letting the rest roll past. Because while Cruz spoke about doctrine, Reyes was observing a more immediate problem. The American 60mm mortars allocated to Philippine units were magnificent weapons, but ammunition shortages meant they fired sparingly, conserving rounds for critical moments that somehow never quite arrived before positions were overrun. The Japanese, meanwhile, had developed a devastatingly effective grenade launcher, the Type 89 knee mortar, improperly named but genuinely terrifying. Light, mobile, capable of dropping explosives behind cover at ranges where rifles were useless, but artillery was overkill. Reyes studied captured examples whenever supply duties brought him near intelligence officers examining enemy equipment. He noted the simple physics: a tube, a firing pin, a propellant charge creating gas expansion that launched a projectile in a parabolic arc. Nothing magical, nothing requiring engineering degrees, just practical understanding of trajectories, propellants, and materials. Over 3 months, during supply runs and equipment maintenance, Reyes began assembling components. A section of bamboo reinforced with steel wire scavenged from destroyed vehicles. Or rubber tubing from a bicycle repair kit found in an abandoned village. A firing mechanism adapted from a damaged American M1 carbine. Captured Japanese Type 91 grenades, which detonated on impact, rather than requiring precision fuses. He tested his first prototype behind a supply depot in January 1945, using van bags as backstops and maintaining careful records of propellant amounts, tube angles, and impact points. The launcher worked, crude, unpredictable, requiring mathematical calculations that Reyes performed using methods his uncle had taught him for calculating water flow in irrigation systems. He presented his findings to Lieutenant Cruz on January 18th, complete with hand-drawn diagrams and firing tables calculated from 24 test launches. Cruz's response was immediate and definitive. "Absolutely not. Sir, on the mathematics, I don't care about your mathematics, Private. I care about standardized equipment, reliable weapon systems, and not having my men killed by experimental devices that might explode in their hands." Cruz had tapped Reyes's diagrams with one finger. "The American military has professional engineers designing these systems. What makes you think a supply clerk can improve on their work?" Reyes had no answer. That wouldn't sound like insubordination. But he kept the launcher, kept testing when opportunities arose, kept refining his calculations. Because the war didn't care about credentials, and the Japanese Type 89 crews didn't check educational backgrounds before dropping grenades into foxholes. By February 1945, when Charlie Company moved into position around Baton's agricultural zones, Reyes had achieved something, approaching reliable accuracy out to 200 meters. His bamboo launcher could lob a Type 91 grenade onto a target the size of a Jeep, roughly 60% of the time, provided he correctly calculated wind, propellant amount, and elevation. 60% wasn't perfect, but 60% was better than 0, which was their current probability of suppressing those machine gun nests before air support arrived. The broader situation in Bataan, February 1945, was this: American forces were systematically liberating the Philippines, but liberation proceeded through grinding, village-by-village combat against Japanese defenders who'd transformed every position into a prepared fortress. MacArthur's return had meant massive American resources, overwhelming firepower, and eventual certainty of victory. But that certainty didn't help individual units facing immediate tactical problems. Charlie Company's problem was geography and timing. They occupied a salient extending into Japanese-controlled agricultural land, necessary for controlling roads that American logistics needed for the main advance. The Japanese, recognizing the position's importance, had established a defensive network of 11 mutually supporting machine gun positions across a 400-meter front, each emplacement protected by sandbags, wooden beams from demolished buildings, and interlocking fields of fire. Standard doctrine said, suppress with mortars, advance under covering fire, reduce positions with grenades and small arms. Reality said, mortar ammunition was allocated to the main offensive, not secondary holding actions. Now, the 65 60mm rounds available to Charlie Company needed to last until resupply, projected for February 17th, 3 days away. The Japanese positions, meanwhile, fired continuously, consuming ammunition from stockpiles they'd been accumulating for weeks. Their Type 92 heavy machine guns could reach out to 800 meters, could punch through sandbags, could turn any attempted advance into a suicide mission. Captain Hendrickson, the American advisor, had seen this tactical problem before. We're facing a defense in depth against an enemy with superior position and adequate ammunition. Our advantages are air support and eventual artillery. We wait for those advantages to arrive. Lieutenant Cruz had agreed immediately. Attempting to suppress those positions with our current resources would waste ammunition and lives. From a professional military perspective, they were absolutely correct. From Domingo Reyes's perspective, lying in a hollow while Japanese machine guns fired over his head, professional correctness was a luxury measured in casualties. Charlie Company had lost 9 men the first day holding this position, 14 the second day, 8 already this morning. At that rate, there wouldn't be a company left to hold the position when air support finally arrived. The Japanese defensive system operated on a simple principle. Overlapping fire zones meant that suppressing one position exposed you to fire from 2 others. Attempting to advance meant crossing open ground under continuous fire from multiple angles. Staying static meant enduring harassment fire, sniper activity, and occasional mortar strikes that the enemy seemed to have ammunition for in abundance. American doctrine addressed this scenario clearly. Combined arms warfare. Mortars suppress. Infantry advances under artillery cover. Tanks provide mobile firepower. But Charlie Company had no tanks. Their artillery support was allocated elsewhere. Their mortars had 65 rounds for a defensive action, projected to last 3 more days. The Japanese knew this. Their observation posts had certainly spotted the lack of American armor, the absence of significant indirect fire. They could calculate ammunition expenditure rates as easily as Hendrickson could. They understood that Charlie Company was isolated, undersupplied, and relying on air support that might or might not arrive on schedule. So they pressed, not with banzai charges or dramatic assaults, but with methodical, professional pressure. Machine gun fire forcing Charlie Company to stay under cover. Occasional mortar strikes preventing reorganization. Sniper activity making movement dangerous even within supposedly safe areas. It was textbook defensive warfare executed by an enemy that had been fighting since 1937 and understood exactly how to leverage positional advantage against numerically superior but resource-constrained opponents. The morning of February 14th had brought new urgency. Japanese activity behind their lines suggested preparation for either a major assault or a withdrawal to new positions. Intelligence couldn't determine which. Yet either scenario demanded that Charlie Company maintain their current position. But maintaining position, while enduring continuous fire, was bleeding the unit away 11 men at a time. Hendrickson had called in air support early, pulling strings with 5th Air Force to request immediate assistance. The response was professional and unhelpful. Aircraft diverted to support main offensive. Estimate arrival your position, 10:30 hours. It was currently 9:47 a.m. 43 minutes might as well have been 43 hours. Private First Class Reyes had been observing the Japanese positions since first light, using a technique his uncle had taught him for watching game trails. Patient attention to patterns, noting repetitions, identifying routines that became predictable with enough observation time. Yet the enemy machine gun and crews rotated every 2 hours. Their ammunition resupply followed a specific pattern. Every 70 to 80 minutes, teams of 4 soldiers moved between positions carrying ammunition boxes, water, and occasionally food. The teams used covered routes when possible, but there was one section, approximately 40 meters of open ground between the 4th and 5th machine gun positions, where they necessarily exposed themselves for 15 to 20 seconds. Reyes had documented 7 resupply runs over 2 days. Each followed the same route. Each occurred within a 10-minute window around the same intervals. The next run, according to his observations, would happen between 9:50 and 10 a.m. He'd shared these observations with Sergeant Eduardo Santos, Charlie Company's senior non-commissioned officer. It was during a lull in firing yesterday evening. Santos, a career soldier from Mindanao, who'd fought in the pre-war constabulary, had listened carefully. "You've been tracking their pattern." "Yes, Sergeant." "And you think we can hit that resupply team?" "I think we can try, Sergeant." "With the launcher?" Santos had frowned, calculating. "Cruz won't authorize it. Neither will Hendrickson." "I know, Sergeant. You'd be firing without authorization, using unauthorized equipment. If it fails, you'll face disciplinary action. If it succeeds, you'll still probably face disciplinary action." Reyes had nodded. "Yes, Sergeant." Santos had studied him for a long moment. "Why?" "Because waiting 43 minutes means losing 11 more men, Sergeant. Maybe 15. And I can hit that resupply team." "Yeah, I've run the calculations." "How certain?" 60%, Sergeant. Maybe 65 if the wind stays consistent." Santos had exhaled slowly. 65% certainty of hitting a target is not exactly overwhelming odds, Private. "No, Sergeant, but it's better odds than charging those machine guns. And it's better than waiting while they keep shooting at us." The sergeant had looked away, toward the Japanese positions, invisible in the darkness. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet. "I won't order you to do this. I won't even acknowledge knowing about it. But if you're going to try something stupid, and probably suicidal, try to do it somewhere I can provide covering fire if everything goes to hell." That had been authorization enough. Now, at 9:47 a.m., Reyes moved carefully through the flooded rice paddy, staying low, using the terrain exactly the way his uncle had taught him to move through the Candaba swamp while hunting. The water was waist-deep in places, cold despite the tropical heat, smelling of vegetation and mud and the distinctive sweet rot smell that meant decomposition nearby. Behind him, Santos had positioned 3 riflemen with instructions to provide suppressive fire if necessary. They didn't know what they were suppressing or why. They knew only that Santos had given orders, and Santos had kept them alive through situations where other units had collapsed. Reyes reached his calculated firing position, a partially collapsed irrigation dike that provided cover while giving clear line of sight to the target area. He unstrapped the bamboo launcher, checked its components with practiced efficiency. The tube, undamaged, its reinforcement wire tight, the firing mechanism, primed, striker clean. The propellant, measured carefully the night before, wrapped in waxed paper to stay dry. The ammunition, 3 Type 91 grenades, carried in a waterproof bag made from a salvaged American poncho. He'd get 3 shots maximum. After that, the Japanese would identify his position and suppress it with everything available. 3 shots to hit a moving target at 180 meters, using a weapon that might generously be called somewhat reliable. Professional military officers would call this insane. Reyes called it the best option available. He assembled the launcher, setting the tube against the dike at an angle he'd calculated would produce approximately 180 meters of range. And his firing tables, hand-drawn on paper now thoroughly soaked with sweat and paddy water, indicated 42 degrees of elevation with the measured propellant charge. The mathematics were simple physics his uncle had explained using water trajectories. Distance equals initial velocity multiplied by time. Time derives from launch angle and gravitational constant. Velocity comes from propellant force divided by projectile mass. Simple physics. Difficult execution. At 9:52 a.m., movement appeared near the 4th Japanese machine gun position. 4 saltouchers, carrying ammunition boxes in the distinctive pattern Reyes had observed 7 times previously. They moved with combat confidence, alert but not panicked. Veterans who understood their defensive network protected them effectively. They started across the open ground. Reyes loaded the first grenade, checking that its impact fuse was armed. His hands were steady. This was the moment that months of secret testing, weeks of observation, and years of his uncle's practical instruction had prepared him for. He'd either validate everything he'd learned, or he'd confirm what Lieutenant Cruz had always believed, that farm boys had no business making tactical decisions. 40 meters of open ground. The resupply team would cross it in 15 to 20 seconds. Reyes aimed carefully, calculating wind drift from the paddy grass movement, confirming his elevation, triple-checking that the propellant was properly positioned. Then he triggered the firing mechanism. The bamboo launcher produced a sound nothing like conventional weapons. A hollow, resonant thump that seemed too soft for something launching a grenade 180 meters. The Type 91 grenade arced upward in a trajectory that looked absurdly high, seeming to hang at its apex before descending toward the Japanese resupply team. Reyes tracked it through pure muscle memory, watching the way his uncle had taught him to watch thrown nets, predicting impact point from launch angle, and observing actual flight against calculated expectations. The grenade struck Earth 2 meters ahead of the lead soldier. The Type 91's impact fuse detonated immediately, producing an explosion that was smaller than American grenades, but devastating at close range. The lead soldier went down. The 3 behind him scattered, one dropping his ammunition box, another stumbling backward. Reyes was already reloading, and the second grenade launched with the same soft thump. This time, he'd adjusted slightly for the 2-meter overshoot, reducing elevation by 3 degrees, an instinctive correction based on comparing observed impact to expected result. The second grenade landed among the scattered soldiers, detonating between 2 of them. The third grenade launched while Japanese machine guns began traversing toward his position, overshot by 5 meters but landed close enough that the enemy team abandoned their ammunition boxes and sprinted for cover. Total elapsed time, 47 seconds. Result? Enemy resupply disrupted, at least 2 casualties visible, ammunition beams abandoned in open ground where Japanese couldn't safely recover them. Then the world exploded with return fire. Machine gun tracers cut through the air above Reyes's position. He's impacting the dike in geysers of mud and splintered earth. He'd already dropped below the dike line, crawling through the paddy water with the launcher strapped across his back, moving perpendicular to his firing position, because staying stationary meant dying. Behind him, Santos and his 3 riflemen opened fire, not at the machine gun positions. That would be suicide. But at other Japanese positions, creating confusion about where the actual threat originated. It was classic fire and movement doctrine, executed instinctively by men who'd survived enough combat to understand that suppressive fire was about creating uncertainty, not necessarily hitting targets. Reyes moved 30 meters through the paddy, feeling bullets snap overhead, hearing the distinctive crack of rounds passing close enough to kill. And he reached another collapsed section of dike and risked looking toward the Japanese positions. The abandoned ammunition boxes remained in open ground. No recovery team had emerged to retrieve them. More importantly, the firing pattern from the Japanese machine guns had changed. Previously sustained and methodical, it was now more sporadic, bursts rather than continuous fire, suggesting crews were rationing ammunition without immediate resupply. It was a small change, barely noticeable to anyone not paying attention. But to Reyes, who'd spent months watching ammunition consumption patterns, it was everything. It meant his launcher worked. It meant disrupting resupply had immediate tactical effects. It meant the weapon Lieutenant Cruz had dismissed as farm boy tinkering could influence battlefield outcomes. It meant he'd been right. Hence the Japanese positions, deprived of their scheduled resupply, and suddenly aware that their previously safe logistics route was compromised, faced an immediate decision: continue current operations with existing ammunition, or pull back to more defensible positions with secure resupply routes. They chose aggression. At 10:03 a.m., 16 minutes before American air support was scheduled to arrive, the Japanese launched a coordinated assault designed to eliminate Charlie Company before air assets could intervene. It was tactically sound. An attacking force is harder to target from the air, and eliminating the American position would allow withdrawal before fighter-bombers arrived. Reyes watched them come from his position in the paddy, And seeing the assault develop with the same patient observation, he'd applied to watching their resupply patterns. Approximately 40 soldiers advancing in squad-sized elements, using terrain effectively, suppressing Charlie Company positions with covering fire from the remaining machine guns. Hendrickson was shouting commands, organizing defensive fire, burning through precious ammunition to stop the assault. Santos had his sector covered, making every shot count. But the Japanese advance was professional and determined. And Reyes understood, with absolute clarity, that this was the moment where his improvised weapon would either prove itself completely or fail catastrophically. He moved through the paddy toward a position offering better angles on the advancing Japanese squads. The launcher remained strapped to his back, as he'd retained 2 more grenades after the resupply strike. Plus, he'd collected 3 additional Type 91s from a cache he'd hidden near the paddy's edge 2 days ago, anticipating exactly this situation. 5 grenades total. He reached a firing position, offering line of sight to the main Japanese assault route, a sunken farm road that channeled their advance through predictable terrain. They were using it because it provided cover from Charlie Company's direct fire, not realizing that high-angle fire could reach into that sunken corridor. Reyes set up his launcher, calculating rapidly. The road was 160 meters distant, running perpendicular to his position. Japanese squads were advancing along it in staggered formation, approximately 10 meters between elements. He aimed not at the leading squad, but at a point 30 meters behind them, was predicting where the follow-on element would be when his grenade arrived. The mathematics were complex, predicting future positions of moving targets, calculating flight time, factoring in that high-angle trajectories took longer than flat trajectories. He fired. The grenade arced high, seemed to hang forever, then plummeted into the sunken road exactly where Reyes had aimed. The explosion caught the second Japanese squad mid-advance, scattering soldiers and halting forward momentum. Reyes reloaded, aimed again, adjusted for the squad attempting to bypass the disrupted element. Thump! The second grenade landed among them, detonating in an eruption of earth and smoke. The Japanese assault wavered. Not breaking, these were experienced soldiers, but hesitating, reassessing whether this axis of advance was viable when unknown weapons were dropping explosives into supposedly safe-covered routes. Reyes fired his third grenade at a squad attempting to flank through a collapsed building. The grenade overshot, landing beyond them, but close enough that the squad reversed course, seeking different cover. His fourth grenade targeted a machine gun team repositioning to support the assault. The teams scattered before the grenade landed, but their gun remained unserviced, creating a gap in Japanese supporting fire. The fifth grenade went to the original assault element, now pinned in the sunken road by defensive fire from Charlie Company, and uncertain whether to advance into whatever was dropping explosives on their heads. 5 grenades, 5 launches, approximately 90 seconds of firing, and 0 catastrophic launcher failures. The results were not overwhelming casualties or dramatic destruction. What Reyes had achieved was something more tactically valuable: uncertainty. The Japanese assault force, previously confident in their numerical advantage and prepared positions, now faced an unknown weapon system that could reach into supposedly safe terrain from unexpected angles. Combat is fundamentally about confidence. Attackers need confidence to advance into fire. Defenders need confidence to hold positions against odds. Reyes's bamboo launcher had shattered Japanese confidence. At 10:08 a.m., the assault faltered. Squad leaders pulled back to covered positions, regrouping, reassessing. The window for overwhelming Charlie Company before air support arrived was closing, and the tactical situation had shifted from certain success to uncertain outcome with unknown variables. Professional military forces don't press uncertain situations when withdrawal remains viable. The Japanese began pulling back. At 10:19 a.m., American P-47 Thunderbolts arrived overhead, their radial engines producing the distinctive sound that meant overwhelming firepower was now available. The pilots identified Japanese positions, made attack runs with .50 caliber machine guns and high explosive bombs, systematically destroying the defensive network that had pinned Charlie Company for 3 days. By 10:47 a.m., the battle was over. Charlie Company had held their position with 8 additional casualties. Terrible, by any measure, but significantly fewer than the projected losses from enduring another 43 minutes of sustained machine gun fire, followed by a Japanese assault without the disruption Reyes's launcher had provided. Lieutenant Cruz found Reyes in the paddy an hour after the P-47s departed, still carrying his bamboo launcher, looking exhausted and soaked, and completely unconcerned about the regulations he'd violated. "Private Reyes." "Sir? Did you—" Cruz stopped, studying the launcher. "Is that the device you showed me in January?" "Yes, sir." "The one I explicitly ordered you not to use?" "Yes, sir." Cruz was silent for a long moment, watching smoke rise from destroyed Japanese positions. When he spoke again, his voice carried something Reyes had never heard from the lieutenant before: uncertainty. Sergeant Santos reported that someone, he claims not to know who, disrupted the Japanese resupply operation at 09:53 hours using unidentified ordnance. Subsequently, this same unknown individual provided fire support during the enemy assault, causing significant disruption to their advance. "I wouldn't know about that, sir." "Private, I'm trying to decide whether to court-martial you or recommend you for commendation." Reyes said nothing. What was there to say? Cruz gestured toward the launcher. "Show me how it works." For the next 20 minutes, in a destroyed rice paddy under tropical sun, Reyes explained the physics of his bamboo launcher, the propellant calculations, the trajectory tables, the firing sequence. Cruz listened with the attention of a man reassessing fundamental assumptions, occasionally asking technical questions that suggested his Manila education had included more engineering than Reyes had expected. When Reyes finished, Cruz was quiet. "You developed this entirely on your own?" "My uncle taught me the mathematics, sir, for irrigation calculations. I adapted them." "Your uncle taught you ballistic trajectory calculations for irrigation?" "Water follows parabolic paths, sir. Same physics as grenades." Cruz actually smiled at that, a brief expression that transformed his usually severe face. "Private Reyes, you have violated approximately 14 different regulations, defied direct orders, and employed unauthorized experimental weapons in combat." "Yes, sir." "You have also, apparently, prevented a Japanese breakthrough, disrupted enemy logistics, and provided critical fire support during an assault that could have overrun our position." Reyes waited. "I'm going to submit a report documenting the tactical effectiveness of improvised high-angle fire support. I'm going to recommend that your weapon be evaluated by American ordnance specialists, and I'm going to spend considerable time thinking about the difference between doctrine and dogma." "Sir?" "Doctrine tells us what should work. Dogma tells us that nothing else can work." I confused the two. Cruz looked toward the Japanese positions. That was a mistake. Captain Hendrickson appeared from the direction of Charlie Company's defensive line, covered in mud and carrying his carbine at low ready. He spotted Reyes, spotted the launcher, and his expression went through several rapid transitions. "Lieutenant? Is that Private Reyes?" "Yes, sir." "Is that the improvised launcher Santos mentioned in his report?" "Yes, sir." Hendrickson approached, studying the weapon with professional interest. "Private, did you construct this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "And you engaged Japanese positions without authorization?" "Yes, sir." Hendrickson turned to Cruz. "Lieutenant, what action are you recommending?" Cruz straightened slightly. "Sir, I'm recommending that Private Reyes be assigned to work with American Ordnance evaluation teams to develop his weapon system for broader tactical application. His improvised launcher proved effective in providing high-angle fire support when conventional systems were unavailable." Hendrickson studied both of them, calculating. "You're aware that employing unauthorized weapons violates standing orders?" "Yes, sir." "And I'm also aware that those standing orders assume conventional weapons availability." Private Reyes identified a tactical gap and developed a solution. A solution that could have exploded in his hands. "But didn't, sir." Hendrickson looked at Reyes. "Private, why did you think this would work?" "Because the physics were sound, sir. And because waiting for air support meant losing more men." "You were willing to risk a court-martial for that?" I was willing to risk a court-martial to stop us from losing 11 more men, sir. Seemed like an acceptable trade. Hendrickson was quiet for several seconds. Then, Lieutenant Cruz, implement your recommendation. Private Reyes, report to S2 for debriefing about enemy positions you observed. After that, you'll work with our ordnance liaison to document your launcher design. Yes, sir. As Hendrickson walked away, Reyes finally allowed himself to relax slightly. Cruz remained, looking uncomfortable. Private. Sir? I was wrong. About your launcher. About improvisation. About assuming that proper military solutions required proper military credentials. Sir, you were working with the information available. Standard doctrine says. Standard doctrine, Cruz interrupted. Failed to account for supply shortages, tactical isolation, and the innovation capacity of supply clerks with engineering uncles. He paused. I apologize for dismissing your work. Reyes had never expected to hear a commissioned officer apologize to a private. Thank you, sir. Cruz nodded, started to leave, then turned back. For what it's worth, Private Reyes, your uncle taught you well. He did, sir. But he never mentioned that irrigation math would win battles. Perhaps, Cruz said, that's because he never had to fight a war in a rice paddy. Private First Class Domingo Reyes spent the following 3 weeks working with American ordnance specialists to refine his bamboo launcher design. The specialists were initially skeptical. American military culture valued engineered solutions from qualified designers. But the tactical effectiveness documented at Bataan convinced them to invest evaluation time. The launcher never became official equipment. American industry produced sufficient quantities of standardized mortars that improvised solutions became unnecessary. But Reyes's firing tables, his propellant calculations, and then his trajectory, mathematics were incorporated into training materials for guerrilla units operating without conventional support. More significantly, his willingness to challenge doctrine with practical innovation influenced a generation of Filipino officers who'd witnessed the Bataan engagement. Lieutenant Cruz went on to command a battalion, eventually retiring as a colonel who was famous for encouraging junior officers to question assumptions and test unconventional solutions. Captain Hendrickson wrote a classified after-action report documenting the tactical value of field improvisation, arguing that American military culture sometimes confused procedural compliance with tactical effectiveness. The report circulated through staff colleges, generating debates about innovation versus standardization that continued into the post-war period. Reyes himself returned to Pampanga after the war, resumed farming, and occasionally taught local students the mathematics his uncle had taught him. He never spoke much about Bataan, except to note that wars were won by soldiers willing to solve problems rather than wait for permission. His bamboo launcher was preserved in a Philippine military museum, labeled as an example of wartime improvisation. Visitors sometimes asked how a supply clerk had designed an effective weapon system without engineering training. The museum curator, a veteran who'd fought in the post-war Hukbalahap insurgency, always gave the same answer. He didn't need engineering training. He needed to understand physics, observe enemy patterns, and care more about solving the problem than protecting his reputation. No one ever doubted him again.